Chapter 3 Modern Encounters with Ancient Stories. I want to fast forward a couple thousand years from where we were before to the year 2019. At that time, I was living in California and had stumbled into teaching a high school ESL class for international students. I had a small group, but that group included freshmen through seniors with a wide range of English language abilities and time in the U.S. Some students had been here a couple of years, while some had only arrived the previous month. Most of my students were from the same country and spoke a language that I don't speak. And taking on the class, I was supposed to be helping the students improve their English, adjust to life in the U.S., acclimate to the particular culture of that private religious school, and succeed in their regular academic classes like chemistry, algebra, and civics. Essentially, I agreed to be all things to all people, to help the students with whatever I could and also be the liaison with their academic subject teachers. Most days, though, I was just trying to get through a class period and have everyone learn at least one thing, whatever it was, and make it as entertaining and hopefully educational as possible. I was allowed to develop a curriculum, and left to my own devices, I did a unit on mythology. I started with the story of the Labyrinth and orally telling it in class, the same one that I told here in Chapter 1. I was trying to make it an interactive experience to keep the students involved, so every time I introduced a new character, I had a student come to the whiteboard and draw it. Before long, the board was populated with some pretty talented depictions of Poseidon, King Minos, Princess Ariadne, and the labyrinth itself. We did not draw the X-rated part with the bull and the queen inside the wooden cow, but I couldn't leave that part out either because it's essential to the plot. I wasn't sure how to describe it to them tactfully with English vocabulary they would understand. Words like consummate were a bit above most their heads. So I think I just said, the queen wanted to have sex with the bull and asked the architect to help her. All the students looked at me in shock. I don't think it was because they were so sheltered that they had never heard the word sex before, but the shock was probably more that a teacher said it in front of them, in combination with what was specifically happening in the story. As soon as the word came out of my mouth, I saw their expression. I was mentally cursing myself for crossing a line and hoping that I wasn't going to be chastised by other teachers or the administration. I also thought, I can't really feel that bad about it because these are teenagers who have access to the internet and they probably see X-rated things every day. Hopefully not during my class, because I broke the school rule about letting students use their phones in class because they told me they needed them to translate. I knew they were using them for this, and I also knew they were abusing the privilege, but there were times the phones were incredibly helpful. For example, as I was continuing the story and got to the part where I was describing the Minotaur, one student yelled out, "I know what that is!" and used his phone to show me an image from a video game. I looked at the picture, and I was excited too, because he was exactly right. As I got done the first cycle of the story, so far as Theseus killing the Minotaur and escaping with Ariadne, then abandoning her on the island, I asked them a series of questions. The first one was, is there anybody in this story you feel sympathy for? One boy raises his hand and says, the Queen. I asked why, even though I could probably guess. He looked at me, and he looked around the room, because clearly he was not sure what he was allowed to say. Then he said, because she had a relationship with an animal and that must have been very bad. I said, yes, I feel bad for her too. Another story said he felt sorry for the princess because she had helped the hero and then she had been left behind. Strangely enough, in this class, no one sympathized with the monster, though usually someone does when I tell this story to a group of adults. I had a follow-up question for the class. Is there anyone in this story you feel you can relate to? Or anyone you feel you have something in common with? And one kid looks at me with a completely straight face and says, the wooden cow. I couldn't keep a straight face. I think I even said, damn. After I told them part one, I continued with part two, the story of Daedalus and Icarus. When I got to the point about how Daedalus kills his nephew because he's jealous of his skill, one student in my class says, "Something like that happened to me." I said, "You got pushed off the top of a temple?" He said, "No. I went to school in another country, and people were jealous of me because I played baseball too well. They wanted to hurt me, so I had to be careful not to be too good or better than anyone." I was quite humbled by that, actually, because when you tell a story, you never know what someone's going to connect with or how it could touch upon their life experience. I felt bad for the kid, but I was also impressed by his honesty. As I was continuing with the story of Daedalus and Icarus and the wings, one student shouts right in the middle of it, "This story is boring. It doesn't even have a monster." I looked at him and I said, "Does every story need to have a monster? This isn't a comic book movie." And I guess for those who have been brought up on the mythology of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, maybe they're just waiting for Thanos or the Green Goblin or every other villain from every Spider-Man movie to just turn the corner and pop up. But this part of the story didn't have a monster, so the student was less of a fan. And I think a mistake I made here too is expecting students to be fascinated by the same things I'm fascinated by, but a lot of teachers do that. So I was trying to explain to the student. I said, "We don't need another monster. Daedalus is the hero, and he's the monster. He was the one who killed his nephew out of jealousy, and he has his own dark secret and his own shameful past about what he did." I guess I reached at least one student, because it was the same student who said he felt like the wooden cow. When I finished telling the story of Daedalus and Icarus, he just paused, and then he said, "There's a lot of philosophy in this story." I said, "What do you mean?" And I think he was struggling to explain it, not because of the language barrier, because the wheels were still turning in his head and the images were still sitting with him. And finally he said, "The architect was only trying to help, but he gets punished. And it's so lonely up there in the tower when you're cut off from everybody." And then he just trailed off. But I was picking up on that, or trying to pick up on something. And I said, when a lot of people hear this story about the father and the son, they think there's a lesson or a moral to it. And one student goes, "Oh." She looked at the board and the pictures that we had drawn, and she started typing something into her phone. She showed me the translate page, and it says, "Avoid the extremes." I said, "Yes, many people think that's an important lesson from a story." And another student says, "It's about life. You can't be too high and you can't be too low." I wrote the word metaphor on the board, which I didn't have to explain to them after they translated it. We got into the whole idea of what it might look like to fly too close to the sun and how teenagers or other people they knew might do these things. I got up on a little soapbox here. We were back to the question of who do you relate to? Does this remind you of anything in your life? And I was like, maybe you do dangerous things and your parents don't like it. Maybe you have a big test and you don't study for it, or you just come to class and see what happens. Maybe you do drugs. Maybe you drive really fast. Maybe this, maybe that. Of course, most of the examples I was giving were things I had done myself at some time or another, but they didn't need to know that. I was really feeling it while I was up there giving this speech, probably more than they were feeling it. I said, "I feel like I've been both. I've been the boy who doesn't follow directions and flies too high and too low. And then there's times where I felt like I've been the father too, where I've had to watch someone doing something dangerous or reckless, and I wasn't able to help them, even if I wanted to." After that myth, we moved on to some short fables and some other stories. A few weeks passed, and the student who made the wooden cow comment, and he was one of the brightest students in my class, actually, I noticed he'd fallen off in his participation. He was fairly moody, and I don't think there's anything wrong with being moody. At one point he told me he was going through his midlife crisis, and he even created the word sad, angry, with a hyphen in the middle to describe how he felt. But this was different because I was so used to him emoting all the time. But when he stopped talking as much, that's when I started to notice. I heard through the grapevine at school that there had been a death in the household of his homestay family. And later on, he actually got suspended. Not because he had done anything malicious or dangerous, but because of some childish stuff he did to look cool in front of his friends. One day I talked to him after class, and I asked him if everything was all right, and was there anything he wanted to talk about? He said, I feel like I'm in that story. I'm the hero, and I'm lost in the maze, and it's very dark, and I don't know what's going on. I said, a lot of people go through that. So you've got to ask yourself, what is your thread? Is there something that you can hold on to help you make your way through this and get out of it? And he gives me this look, and he says, no princess ever gave me a thread. I said, somebody else doesn't give it to you. It's already inside you. And he just gave me another look. Because I was always telling the kids stuff like this. And they were probably like, who is this American woman always trying to act like our big sister and say things off of motivational posters? And why can't she just let us watch movies on her phone in class? And there were times I think I was really off-putting to them because they never watched the Dead Poet Society or absorbed any of these other hero teacher movies and knew what to make of this. So I think they usually just brushed me aside. But whatever that student made of this advice, whether or not it meant anything to him or he dismissed it, his ups and downs continued through the school year, and mine did too. At the end of the year, both of us ended up leaving that school. But I do hold to what I said to him, which is that there is a thread inside of you. It's inside you, it's inside him, it's inside me. There's a principle in depth psychology that just as within a dream, it's the same in the mythic stories. So just as every character in a dream is somehow a part of you, every character in one of these stories is a part of you as well. There's some part of your psyche that's personified by each of them. So, you are the hero. You are the shadow monster. You are the tyrannical king. You are the princess who gives a thread, and you are the thread. There is something inside of you that you can follow to lead you out of the dark places.